Let's take a look at how you can set up a scalable Next.js project. First things first, I would recommend using a boilerplate. This will provide you with a solid starting point to which you can later add other libraries and customize according to your needs. For this, I would recommend using the T3 stack, which is a way to start a full stack, completely type-safe Next.js application. This will scaffold your application with some basic ESLint configuration, validation for environment variables, and some libraries that you can choose from. So let's start by running this command, npm create t3 app latest. So I'll come here over to my terminal and I'll say yarn create t3 app at latest. Now I'm going to use yarn, but you can use pnpm if you want. Now I wouldn't recommend using npm, as yarn and pnpm are inherently better. They take up less space in your disk and they are overall faster. So now it's going to ask you for the name for this project. In my case, I'll just say Next.js demo. Now here we're going to be using TypeScript, and if you want a scalable and maintainable project, you will not be using a dynamic language. So TypeScript it is. Now we will be using Tailwind, and this is twofold. One, it is preference. I like Tailwind a lot, but Tailwind is great for maintainability. The reason is because if you know Tailwind, anyone can jump straight into your code and start developing. Since all of the classes it provides are atomic, you do not have to think about where you're going to create your CSS files or what your classes will be named. Everything will be standardized, and this is pivotal for maintainability. So I would highly recommend using Tailwind. Now TRPC. This is a great library for that end-to-end type safety between the client and the server, which in my opinion is one of the most valuable libraries you can leverage nowadays. And the great benefit of using TRPC is you can pretty much copy and paste the TRPC folder and host it in an Express server or in any other framework or library of your liking. Or you can migrate it to a monorepo, so you're not going to end up tied to the Next.js ecosystem. If you down the road want to move over to something like Remix, or even to a completely different framework like Vue, then again you can just copy and paste your TRPC logic and use it anywhere. So this is a huge yes for me. Now for authentication they have Next.auth, but personally I wouldn't recommend it. Unless you need a very basic auth system and you're not planning to have total control over your authentication. The reason I wouldn't recommend it is because the documentation is terrible and it abstracts a lot away from you. So you will end up shooting yourself in the foot in the long run. So for me, I'll say none, but if you really want to, you can use Next.auth. Now for the database ORM, you can use Prisma or Drizzle or your own. Now Prisma is great if you want to iterate fast. It has the best type safety of all ORMs out there, but as far as I'm aware, it doesn't support joins. Now I believe in a near future we will have joins, but that's quite the performance hit. Now as for Drizzle, I believe it doesn't support insert into, select from, but I've heard it is a great ORM. Now personally, I like Kisely a lot. It is basically typed SQL, so there's really no abstraction other than TypeScript itself. So if you want the best performing client for your database, I would really recommend Kisely. So for this, I'll say none. Now here, would you like to use Next.js App Router? Now this is hit or miss. The App Router is still in its early stages, and the ecosystem hasn't caught up yet. So if we're talking about scalability and maintainability, perhaps the App Router wouldn't be the wise choice now. But in a way, it is the future of Next.js. So here, whichever floats your boat. You can stick to the Pages router, but for demonstration purposes, I'll use the App Router. And yes to a Git repository, and yes to Yarn. Now import alias, this is very important. this is the path alias. So you do not have to do .. all the way until you get to that file. You can just use an import alias that is going to map your character. So for example, the @symbol to the root of the project. So for this, you can use whichever character you want. I'll use the @symbol. Now, once you have created the application, if you're using Yarn like I'm doing, what I would recommend is not use the plug and play, which is this one. If you're using the latest Yarn versions, which no longer use the node modules directory. So for that, what I would do is delete these files. So the .pnp and the .yarn directory. And then I would come here and say yarn config set, then node linker, in camel case, and then node modules. And once this is done, we can say yarn install again. And as we can see, it created the node modules directory. Now what I would do in a project is lock the versions, so only allow yarn. So if someone tries to install using npm or pnpm, they will not be allowed to do that, alongside with locking the node version. So in my case, if I say node, then version, I'm using this version, which is the previous long-term support. If I use nvm and then list, as we can see, these are all of the available versions. Now in a scalable project, you would be using LTS, which is long-term support. And in my case, I'm using this one. Now you might be tempted to use the latest long-term support version, but I wouldn't recommend that, as a lot of cloud providers do not support this node version yet. So when that time comes, just update your node version. So for this, we can come here over to the package.json, and then after the scripts, we can add this property. So engines, and then we say node must be greater than or equal to this version, and then same for yarn. So in my case, if I say yarn and then version, as we can see, I'm using this version, which I believe is the latest stable release of Yarn. So in this case, if someone tried to use a node version that is not compatible with this one, or npm instead of Yarn, they would get a warning, so they know that it might not work as intended. Now, as for locking to only use Yarn, so if someone is using npm, we do not get that package lock.json file in Git, we can say here pre-install, and this will be run before someone installs the dependencies. So we can say npx only allow yarn. This way, if they try using something else, they will not be able to do so. Now, what about the node version? It can be quite tedious to learn that the project requires the 18 version. And now you need to go over, look up that version and install it. Well, for that, I would highly recommend using nvm, which is Node Version Manager. And this is simply like npm, Node Package Manager, but for the version of Node itself. So you can come here over to nvm in the GitHub repository. You get instructions on installing and updating nvm. But here we have usage. So we can say nvm install node, and this will install the latest release of Node. You can also install a specific version of Node. So like this one, you can pass in any version that you want, or you can say nvm ls and then remote to list all of the available remote versions. So this is really nice. As we can see, we can install multiple nvm versions, and we can just switch between versions with a single command. So for this, what I recommend is come here over to the root of the project and create a file called nvm.rc. So .nvm.rc, and then here LTS hydrogen, which is the one that I'm using, which is the previous long-term support version. Now here, in fact, you can use this version instead, and you can likewise restrict it to this version solely, and not something greater than or equal to this version. But for simplicity's sake, I'll just use the name of the version. Now, by creating this file, if someone navigates to the root of this project in their terminal, they can simply run nvm use, and it is going to find this file, as we can see here, and it is going to set the node version to this one. So as you can see, this is just a way so all developers are on the same page. Now, once we have this, I would recommend setting up a Prettier configuration for the project. So again, so everyone is on the same page. So for this, I like to use this one. So print with 100 and actually 120, single quote false, semi for semicolons to true, tab width to 2, trailing comma is 5, use tabs false, so use spaces, then bracket spacing and end of line to LF. So here you can set up your own configuration, but it's important you set one. Now let's move on to setting up Husky and Commitlint. Now these two help enforce good commit practices. So for this, open up your terminal and install these dependencies. So we're going to have Husky for the pre-commit hooks, then Commitlint, so that it is going to check the commit message for us, the conventional configuration, so this one right here, where you must pass in a type, so build, chore, CI, docs, etc. for your commit messages. So if you say foo and then some message, this is going to fail. And if you say fix, so any of these prefixes, it is going to pass just fine. And there are many more. So make sure that it is not empty, that there is a subject, that you can pass in a scope, etc. And this is all configurable. And finally, we're going to install lint staged so that we can run ESLint and Prettier for staged files. That way, if you're going to commit something, it is going to automatically do the formatting with Prettier and automatically validate the files with ESLint. So once you have installed them, you can come here to the root and create a file called Commitlint, then .config.cjs or common.js. And then we can say module.exports, and we simply export this object with an extends property, which is an array. And then here you can pass in the configuration. In this case, we're gonna stick to the conventional configuration, which we just installed. But with this, we now need to have a way to run Prettier and ESLint for these staged files. So we can come here to the package.json, and here we can add a lint staged property. So we're going to run ESLint, then fix for all of these files that are found staged in Git, which are about to be committed. And same for these ones for Prettier. So you can modify these however you want. Now, right now, this lint staged will not do anything, and that is until we actually set up the commit hooks. But before doing that, let's set up ESLint. So open up your terminal and add these two. So ESLint plugin React and ESLint plugin Tailwind CSS. Once you have them, you can now come here and open the ESLint configuration file and replace everything with the configuration I left in the description. So in short, all I did was configure the ESLint plugin for React and for Tailwind, alongside with some rules that will make your code more legible and also less error prone. So if I scroll down, all of these pertain to TypeScript, and here we have the rules for React and here for Tailwind. If you're interested, you can check each rule one by one and check the corresponding documentation so that you know why I added that rule. For example, we have no var, so you cannot create variables with var, and also prefer const over let. So once you have all of these rules, what we can do is add the Husky hooks, which are going to execute the Commitlint configuration to make sure that your commit message follows this config conventional, and also the other one for running ESLint and Prettier. So now we need to set up the pre-commit hooks. So for this, we need to initialize Husky. So we can open up the terminal and write yarn dlx and then husky-init. And as we can see, this created a Husky directory, and it contains a sample pre-commit hook, which all it does is run the test script. And it also added this prepare script, which runs before the package is packed and published, and on local npm install. So it is going to automatically add Husky to whoever clones this project. So now we can open up this pre-commit file and instead of running npm test, we can run yarn lint staged. So it is going to run this right here, all of this, for the staged files, whenever you commit something. And what about the commit message itself? Well, we can create a file here, which is simply commit-message, like so. And then we can pretty much copy this, paste it here, and then run yarn dlx and then commitlint and then --edit. That way it makes sure that the commit message follows the configuration we provided, which is in this file. So now we need to make sure that these two hooks are set as executable. So if you're using Linux, what you can do is say change mode. So we're going to change the access permissions of these files. And then we can say +X to add execute permission so that we can execute the hooks. And then we can say .husky/ and then commit message. And we can do the same for the pre-commit. And with this, the hooks should now work. So let's give it a try. I'll say git add everything, then git commit -m, and then we can say test. And as we can see, we get some ESLint errors. So this one failed. Now the Prettier formatting worked, but we get some errors. So we need to resolve them. So as we can see, this is great, because now you ensure that anyone who pushes something to your repository follows the conventions that you specified. Now what happens if I fix all errors? Well, if I come here and say git commit and then test once again, all of these should pass. As we can see, there were no ESLint errors, and Prettier successfully formatted the files. However, we get an error saying subject may not be empty and type may not be empty. So we need to pass in the type. So we can say git commit and then -m and then chore and then test, for example. And if we do this, as we can see, we successfully committed. And if I say git log, as we can see, we have this test. So everything is working as intended. Now, what if you need to commit something and not run these hooks for some reason? Maybe you have a pull request and you're going to squash all of your commits, but it's necessary for you to commit and push those changes, and you may have some ESLint errors. Well, for that, if I come here, let's say in the page.csx, and let's say const x is equal to 5, we get an error as x is assigned a value but never used. And this comes from ESLint, which is this rule. So if I add everything and then git commit and then say test2, as we can see, it failed. X is assigned a value but never used. For that, you can say git commit and then use this flag --no, then verify. And this is going to skip all of your commit hooks altogether. And if we do this, as we can see, we get this commit, even though there is an ESLint error here. Now, obviously, you shouldn't use this every single time. You shouldn't be avoiding the rules that your project has. And in fact, what I'd recommend to avoid this is set up a GitHub action that is going to make sure that there are no ESLint errors before you can merge into another branch. For example, you open up a pull request, you push all of your changes, and for every single commit that you push, it is going to make sure that there are no ESLint errors, and well, any other validation that you may have in place. That way, you cannot merge into the main or staging branch unless those errors have been resolved. So now with this, we have successfully configured the project. But what about best practices then? We already have ESLint, and that's a great start, but project structure is equally important. For that, you should collocate everything. For example, here with the T3 stack, they created this directory, _components, and then create post, and so this is collocated, which means that this lives only for this page. I've seen some people create a top-level directory, so components, and then here they start adding all components. So these create post.tsx, and then they may have another for user, so delete user.tsx, and then they may have nested pages, so the page for user or me, so the user can edit themselves, and then they have the page here, and then they may have another one for update avatar.tsx, and this becomes a mess because everything is spread apart. There is no clear distinction of what belongs to what. And as your project grows, you're going to have countless of components, and that's just unfeasible. So for that, please use Colocation. That means that, for example, for the me page, you could have another folder, which is lib, and this is the library for this page. And then here you can have a components directory, and then you create all of the components pertaining solely to this page. Same for types, then for utils. And what if this me page shares a component found within the root page, which is this one? Well, for that you can use this library. So you can create one for lib, and then here you could have components, and from this library you can import it to this page, to the me page. That's completely fine, and that's what Colocation aims to do. Everything is organized in such a way that everything lives as closely as possible. So if you have another page and another nested page, and that very nested page needs to use the component of the top level page, that's completely fine. Use that component defined in the top level directory. That's the whole idea around Colocation. So it doesn't really matter what pattern you use. As long as everything is collocated, everything will be very easy to work with. So for example, I recently published a video on how to do internationalization with Next.js, specifically with the app router. If you're interested in that, go check out my channel. You'll find the video there, or I'll also link it in the description. But what I'm trying to say is, with these internationalization libraries, you usually manage all of your translations here. So you have a messages directory, and then English.json, and then Spanish.json. And these translations will be used per component. So this create post component will have translations for internationalization. So you have to come here and say create post, and then title create post, for example, and then you have the same for English. Well, of course this would be in Spanish, but you get my point. But what if this gets increasingly larger and larger? You have over 200 components. What are you going to do then? You could have a JSON file of over 10,000 lines, but is it maintainable? You would be scared to touch that file at all. Well, for that you should also leverage Colocation. So you would create a directory, create post, then within this directory you have the component itself, then you have an index file which exports everything from this create post, so /create post component. That way you do not get nested import paths, which would be import create post from /create post and then /create post. So this is why we use this index file to just do this instead. And this allows us to collocate this even further. So we can create another one for I18N internationalization. And then you have an n.json and s.json and whichever other language you're going to support. And here you could instead extract these to this file and do the same for the English one. That way everything is tightly collocated. But now you might be wondering, sure, this would be great, but these libraries do not provide you a way to have this structure because it will read everything from the messages directory. And that's true, but this is your code. You can do whatever you want. So you can come here and create a directory called the scripts. And here you may have a merge i18n.ts file, which is going to search for all of the i18n directories like this one, take all of the content, and then add them minified to the corresponding translation files. So you would add yarn add and then -d tsx which lets you execute TypeScript files without emitting a JavaScript file. And then you could come here to your package.json and then add a post install. So post install, and this would be yarn run i18n merge. And then you would have the i18n merge, which would simply run tsx./scripts and then merge, I believe, merge i18n.ts. And so this is going to automatically, every time you install a dependency, or if this is your first time cloning and running the project, it is going to execute this script automatically. And every time you change a translation file, all you need to do is run this manually. So run script, and it is going to add them here. So for example, we have n create post, and then here we have this translation. And then what you could do is come here and simply say yarn run i18n and then merge. And as we can see, it processed the two. And if I come here, we have the create post and the Spanish one. So we're leveraging colocation to its best. And trust me, down the road, colocation will be the most important concept you will have ever embraced. So now this wraps up the video. If you want to see more content like this, make sure to subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.